Respected Professor Sugata Bose, Gardiner Professor of Oceanic History and Affairs, Harvard University, and our honorable speaker today, Principal Dr. Madhu Manjari Mondol, Vice Principal Dr. Shupratim Das, IQAC Coordinator Dr. Shamrat Bhattacharya, Bursar Dr. Raju Sri Ghosh, Senator Secretary Dr. Bidisha Sinha, TCS Dr. Indrani Kaur, and also our special guest today, Dr. Mukhuti, the Secretary of the College Council. Distinguished guests, friends, students, on behalf of Scottish Church College, I welcome you to this, our 9th Alexander Duff Memorial Lecture, where we begin a program in the memory of a missionary and in a college set up by that missionary. It is entirely appropriate to begin with a prayer asking for the Lord's blessings. I would request Reverend Martin Pakhare to kindly.
Before I pray, one of the quotes which is very close to my heart, I'll read it. I will lay my bones by the Ganges, that India might know there is one who cares. The church which ceases to be evangelical will soon cease to be evangelical. Let's pray. Father God, we come in your holy presence this morning to know and understand your chosen one, Dr. Alexander Duff, who established wonderful work in higher education, reaching out to everyone, educating and caring for everyone. Today, as we are together going to listen and understand a wonderful plan and purpose, wonderful history. Oh God, help us to be a human being who can always care and will have concern for others. Keep us together as we listen, oh God, to this wonderful lecture by your chosen vessel, Dr. Sugata Bose, who is here to speak and to interact. Gracious Father, take charge of everything. Let your Holy Spirit lead and guide, and let your will be done. For we ask this in Jesus Christ's name. Amen.
Let me trouble you once more. Can we all rise up, please? It is song number 5, page number 35. And the same has been. O God, our help in ages past, our hope for years to come, our shelter from the stormy blast, and our eternal home. Under the shadow of thy throne, still may we dwell secure. Sufficient is thine arm alone, and our defense is sure. Before the hills in order stood, or earth received a frame. From everlasting thou art God, to endless years the same. 1,000 ages in thy sight are like an evening gone. Short as the watch that ends the night before the rising sun. O God, our help in ages past, our hope for years to come. Be thou our guide while life shall last, and our eternal home.
Kindly be seated. I would like to begin by referring to the dedication that we find attached to George Smith's book, The Life of Alexander Duff, D.D., LLD. And this is what is inscribed on the first page. To the peoples of India is inscribed this life of the Christian missionary, whose latest published words were these, and I quote from Duff's words: "Wherever I may be, wherever I stay, my heart is in India, in deep sympathy with its multitudinous inhabitants, and in earnest longings for their highest welfare in time and in eternity." These words were Dr. Duff's, the founder principal and the first overseas missionary to India from the Church of Scotland, who had arrived in Calcutta after 2 shipwrecks with only his Bibles for comfort on 27th May 1830. Born in Perthshire, Scotland on 25th April 1806 and ordained in the spring of 1829, licensed by the Presbytery of St. Andrews, he had arrived with deep devotion and great zeal to serve the Lord in India. Then we find that he was given a brief to set up an educational institution in Calcutta or near about Calcutta. Dr. Duff deviated from the original plan. He did not go to the rural belt of Calcutta, and he selected a spot in the heart of Calcutta to set up his school. The school started on 13 July 1830 with 5 students and the help of Raja Ram Mohan Roy, because he was instrumental in getting students and the space that Dr. Duff used for the school initially. The seed that was sown by Dr. Duff on 13 July 1830 is growing for 200 years. Let us look forward to the Lord's blessings for more such 200 years for this institution. This lecture series was instituted in the year 2013 by the then principal, Dr. John Abraham, to pay homage to Dr. Duff, our founder principal. And we continue with that tradition. This is the 9th lecture to be given by our eminent speaker today, Dr. Sugata Bose. May I now request our principal to offer the formal welcome message.
Namaskar. Good morning. It is my great privilege to welcome Professor Sugata Bose, Honorable Speaker of today's Reverend Dr. Alexander Duff Memorial Lecture 2023-24. May I request all of you to join me to welcome him with a round of applause. Thank you. Honorable distinguished guests as audience, Dr. Shapan Kumar Mukuti, Secretary, Scottish Church College Council, Dr. Supratim Das, Vice Principal, Dr. Shamrat Bhattacharjee, IQAC Coordinator, Dr. Rajyasree Ghosh, Bursar, Dr. Bidisha Sinha, Senator Secretary, Dr. Indrani Kaur, Teachers Council Secretary, my respected colleagues, and my beloved students. On behalf of Scottish Church College family, I welcome you all. From 2013, the college has begun holding an annual lecture dedicated to the memory of its founder father, Dr. Alexander Duff, to be delivered by an eminent personality. The first lecture held on 13 July 2013 as part of the 184th Foundation Day celebration was delivered by the then Governor of Orissa and our alumnus, Padma Bhushan, Dr. S.C. Jamir. Since then, lectures have been held and which were delivered by Sri Dwahar Sarkar in 2014, Dr. Bikash Sinha in 2015, Professor Uma Dasgupta in March 2017, Dr. Polash Boron Pal in September 2017, Dr. Shekhar Bandopadhyay in 2019, Professor Dipesh Chakraborty in December 2020, Professor Ishita Banerjee Dubey in April 2022. So today we have assembled here to celebrate the 9th Reverend Dr. Alexander Duff Memorial Lecture. I am grateful to our honorable speaker today that in spite of his busy schedule, he has given us his consent to come to our college and deliver the lecture. In this regard, I am also thankful to Professor Suranjan Das, who is one of our honorable council members and who actually helped us to contact honorable speaker today. We had a dream to have him amidst us, as he has a deep connection as direct descendant of one of our most eminent alumni, that is Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose. And today, the dream has come true. I am grateful to God Almighty. I wish all the best to our IQAC, Internal Quality Assurance Cell, for organizing this lecture in this year. May God bless our college, which is running 194th year, and may He bless us all. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am, for your warm words of welcome, as well as your brief foray into the history of the college and the lecture. A lot of people here may not know about it, and they will definitely benefit. We will now felicitate our chief guest today. May I request Dr. Mukherjee to kindly greet him with a bouquet of flowers. He will be assisted by Professor Tamanna Sultana. Thank you, Professor Mukherjee. Thank you, Tamanna. Kindly be seated. Now may I request our principal, Dr. Madhumanjari Mondol, to kindly greet our speaker today. She will be assisted by Professor Shomali Mukherjee. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, Dr. Mukherjee. May I now request our Vice Principal, sir, to kindly greet our chief guest today with a memento and a copy of our commemoration volume that we had published for Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose. He is being assisted by Dr. Tamanna Sultana. Thank you, Tamanna. Thank you, Dr. Das. And now, you can't come to North Kolkata and not have mishti. So we have some mishti for Professor Bose, and that will be handed over by our IQAC coordinator, Dr. Shamrat Bhattacharya. Thank you, Dr. Bhattacharya, and thank you, Shomali. Without taking up any more of your time, I shall hand the microphone over to our Vice Principal to introduce today's speaker.
A very good morning. Actually, to my mind, Professor Sugata Bose needs no introduction. But as a formality, I need to introduce him to you, the audience. Professor Sugata Bose is the Gardiner Professor of Oceanic History and Affairs, Harvard University. He has served as Director of Graduate Studies in History at Harvard and as the founding director of Harvard's South Asia Institute. Prior to taking up the Gardiner Chair at Harvard in 2001, Bose was a fellow of St. Catherine's College, University of Cambridge, and Professor of History and Diplomacy at Tufts University. Bose was educated at Presidency College, Calcutta, and the University of Cambridge, where he obtained his PhD. His many books include Modern South Asia, History, Culture, Political Economy with Aisha Jalal. The 5th edition has been published in 2022. 100 Horizons, The Indian Ocean in the Age of Global Empire, 2006. His Majesty's Opponent, Subhash Chandra Bose and India's Struggle Against Empire, published in 2011. A special 10th anniversary edition was published last year. The Nation as Mother and Other Visions of Nationhood, 2017. And Asia After Europe, Imagining a Continent in the Long 20th Century. This is just forthcoming, and this book will be published next year in February. He was a recipient also of the Guggenheim Fellowship in 1997. Sugata Bose served as a Member of Parliament in India, elected to the 16th Lok Sabha 2014-2019, representing the Jadavpur constituency of Bengal, and throughout that period, he served as a member of the Parliamentary Standing Committee on External Affairs. Today, he will speak on an extremely interesting subject, art, poetry, and music in Asian conversations. Actually, drawing on his forthcoming book, Asia After Europe, Imagining a Continent in the Long 20th Century, he will perhaps interpret artistic and literary interactions across Asia by tracking the intersecting journeys of an array of Asian intellectual and cultural figures. From the brief abstract of his lecture that he has sent me, we can guess that tracking the circulation of ideas and people across colonial and national borders, Sugata Bose will explore developments in Asian thought, art, and politics that defied Euro-American models and defined Asianness as a locus of solidarity for all humanity. So once again, I would say that this is definitely going to be a very interesting theme, a very interesting subject, and I would now invite our esteemed speaker, Professor Bose, to deliver his lecture, and I'm sure there will be too many questions and interactions after his lecture. So over to Professor Sugata Bose.
Principal Dr. Madhumanjari Mondal, Vice Principal Dr. Supratim Das, Dr. Mukhoti, Dr. Bhattacharya, কলকাতা শহরের সুধীবৃন্দ, স্কটিশের অধ্যাপক অধ্যাপিকাবৃন্দ, ছাত্রছাত্রীবৃন্দ, আপনাদের সঙ্গে আজ মিলিত হতে পেরে আমি সত্যিই খুব আনন্দিত। প্রথমেই আমি ডক্টর আলেকজান্ডার ডাফ সাহেবকে আমার বিনম্র শ্রদ্ধা জানাই, যার নামাঙ্কিত বক্তৃতা আজ দেবার জন্য আমাকে আপনারা আমন্ত্রণ জানিয়েছেন। আরও একজনের কথা একটু বলতে চাই, তিনি ডক্টর আর্কহার্ট, যিনি 1917 সালে স্কটিশ চার্চ কলেজের প্রিন্সিপাল ছিলেন, এবং তিনি না থাকলে সুভাষচন্দ্র বসুর লেখাপড়া শেষ হতো না, বিএ ডিগ্রিটাও মিলত না। তার আত্মজীবনী অ্যান ইন্ডিয়ান পিলগ্রিমে সুভাষচন্দ্র ডক্টর আর্কহার্টের প্রশংসা করেছেন এবং লিখেছেন যে তার দর্শনের বক্তৃতা, ফিলসফি লেকচার্স আর বাইবেল লেসন্স সুভাষচন্দ্রের খুবই পছন্দ ছিল। তাছাড়া আপনারা অনেকেই হয়তো জানেন যে এখানকার ফিলোসফিক্যাল সোসাইটির সঙ্গে যুক্ত ছিলেন সুভাষচন্দ্র ছাত্র হিসেবে এবং দুটি পেপার পড়েছিলেন, ইন ডিফেন্স অফ মেটেরিয়ালিজম, এবং তার বেশ কিছু সমালোচনা হয়েছিল, এবং তারপরে আরেকটি পেপার পড়েছিলেন ইন ডিফেন্স অফ আইডিয়ালিজম, সেটির জন্য বেশ কিছু প্রশংসা তার ভাগ্যে জুটেছিল। আমি আজকে আমার যে বইটি বেরোবে ফেব্রুয়ারি মাসে, এশিয়া আফটার ইউরোপ, হার্ভার্ড ইউনিভার্সিটি প্রেসের বেলকন্যাপ প্রেস থেকে প্রকাশিত হবে, তার ভিত্তিতে আমি আজকের বক্তৃতাটি দেব। কারণ আমার মনে হলো, যদিও আমার একবার খেয়াল হয়েছিল যে হয়তো স্কটল্যান্ড এবং ইন্ডিয়ার উপরে বক্তৃতা দেওয়া যায় কি না, কিন্তু আমার মনে হলো যে বিষয়ে এই সম্প্রতি কাজ করেছি, যে বইটি এখনও বেরোয়নি, তারই একটা ছোট্ট প্রিভিউ আপনাদের দিলে হয়তো ভালো লাগবে। আমি শুনেছি যে আলেকজান্ডার ডাফ মেমোরিয়াল লেকচার ইংরেজিতেই দেওয়ার রেওয়াজ, তাই আপনাদের সকলকে নমস্কার জানিয়ে আমার বক্তৃতা আমি এখন শুরু করছি। The year was 1903. Abanindranath Tagore removed a huge European oil painting from the wall of his studio and sold it to the wealthy art collector Rajendranath Mollik. This was to create space for an Asian work of art to be executed by Yokoyama Taikan. The chosen theme was Rash Leela, the love play of Radha and Krishna on a full moon night. Abanindranath described the scene to Taikan. A young girl modelled the wearing of a sari. Taikan crouched on the floor and began work. First, he did a drawing on silk with coal and then began applying colour. Within a few days, the painting was near completion. The sky shone with moonlight, but Taikan was not satisfied. Every day he removed the cloth cover from the unfinished work and said something was missing. One morning, he arrived to find that the women at home had collected fresh shiuli, the fragrant white autumnal flower, on a plate, and some had blown across the room. Taikan picked up the flowers and scattered them on his painting in great delight. Putting them back on the plate, he then picked up one flower in his left hand and, looking at it closely from all angles, began applying its white and orange colours to his work of art. The moonlit night soon came alive with a rain of flowers from the sky, and the breeze dropped them in the midst of the dance of Rash Leela. Taikan planted a kodam flower in Radha's hand, draped a garland of shiuli flowers round her neck, and curled a bunch around Krishna's flute as well. At last, the painting was hung on the wall after Taikan had framed it himself, decorating it with the border of a baluchari sari. A party was thrown for friends to come and watch Rash Leela. The process of mutual understanding and learning through artistic conversations across Asia unfolded gradually. A dishevelled Taikan wearing a straw hat would roam the bazaars of Calcutta, furiously sketching every detail that caught his eye. Used to the rich colours of Mughal and Persian paintings, Abanindranath's eye could not at first see the smoky touch of Taikan's coal on silk, dusted away with a feather to be topped with a light brush of ink. In time, he began to appreciate this style. Yokoyama Taikan and Hishida Shunso embraced Indian themes in their works. Taikan's painting of the goddess Kali and Hishida's of Saraswati, both adorned with white lotuses, were bought by a family elder, the feisty patriot Sarala Devi's mother, Sharnakumari Devi. Having observed Taikan soak his paintings in water, Abanindranath took the plunge himself and was impressed with the beautiful effect it had on his canvas. From that moment onwards, the Japanese wash became an intrinsic element in Indian painting. Okakura Tenshin had described Taikan as someone who had brought into the artistic field represented by the Nippon Bijutsin school his wild imagery and tempestuous conceptions. This was displayed in his 1898 painting Kutsugen Wandering on the Barren Hills, amongst wind-blown narcissus, the flower of silent purity, feeling the raging storm that gathers in his soul. The fresh white autumn flowers of Bengal appear to have had a soothing effect on the artist who had followed Okakura's trail to India from the land of the peony, lotus, and chrysanthemum. The artistic bond forged between Yokoyama Taikan and Abanindranath presaged the fusion of Indian nationalism and Asian universalism during the Swadeshi movement of 1905. Having learned the technique of the Japanese wash from Taikan, Abanindranath painted an arresting image of the mother nation in that style. Sister Nivedita was taken by it. Initially conceived as Bongo Mata, the painting was at her suggestion retitled as Bharat Mata. Nivedita did not fail to notice its broader Asian inspiration. She wrote in her critical appreciation, "The curving line of lotuses and the white radiance of the halo are beautiful additions to the Asiatically conceived figure with its 4 arms as the symbol of the divine multiplication of power. This is the first masterpiece in which an Indian artist has actually succeeded in disengaging, as it were, the spirit of the motherland, giver of faith and learning, of clothing and food, and portraying her as she appears to the eyes of her children." The iconic Swadeshi image was not devoid of a Bideshi touch. On a warm day in June 1915, the young sociologist Binoy Kumar Sarkar waited in his hotel lobby in Tokyo for Yon Noguchi, poet and professor of English literature at Keio University. Binoy Babu set off with Noguchi by tram and then train to his village home, some 17 or 18 miles outside the capital. The poet's wooden cottage in the midst of a forest and fields looked like a kakemono work of art. His study and an adjoining room for guests had Japanese paintings on the walls, while the bookshelves contained works of English poetry and criticism. Binoy Kumar learnt that Noguchi had received a letter from Rabindranath Tagore saying that he would be visiting Japan soon and that the main purpose of his visit would be to have conversations about Japanese literature and art. Binoy Babu thought Indians should be aware that Noguchi could partially fill the void left by Okakura's passing 2 years earlier. In his view, Goldsworthy Lewis Dickinson, in his book Appearances, had got Japan quite wrong, having been misled by the sight of some banks and shops, electric lights and train stations, a few professors and businessmen in hats and coats, into portraying the whole of Japan as Euro-America's Mofussil. In order to understand the true Japan, it was necessary to find interpreters like Noguchi and to independently view the interior and exterior of Japanese society with eyes open. Binoy Babu quoted 2 poems, The Poet and The Lotus, from Noguchi's collection Pilgrimages. The lotus revealed his introspective nature. The one lotus, whiter than prayer, before me rose fall as a dream. With the sunlight fallen through the clouds, the flower smiled the sorrow of heaven. This sounded to Binoy Kumar like the melody of Tagore's Gitanjali. If the Swadeshi links were primarily cultural, suffused with an anti-colonial spirit, World War I afforded the opportunity for youthful daring on both intellectual and political planes. The first institution on Binoy Babu's itinerary was Tokyo Imperial University, where he visited the library and museum. He had already met Tokyo's professor of Buddhist literature, Masaharu Anesaki, at Harvard. A visit to the editorial office of Kokka provided the occasion for a conversation about art. The editor, Taki Seiichi, taught art history at Tokyo University and had visited India. Binoy Babu saw Nandalal Bose's painting Koikei on Taki's wall. He was then taken to the performance of No plays by Noguchi and described No as Japanese Gombhira, in sharp contrast to Dickinson's analogy with Greek drama. Preaching morals and theorizing on quotidian life through plenty of satire and humor were the hallmarks of both genres. At a Tuesday evening gathering of writers, Binoy Kumar found that the impending visit of Rabindranath had created quite a stir. The Japanese translation of Sadhana, based on Tagore's 1913 Harvard lectures, had sold thousands of copies. The Japanese did not appreciate the Nobel-winning Gitanjali as much. At another venue, Binoy Babu met Hattori Unokichi, a scholar of Chinese philosophy and literature who had spent time at Peking University and was poised to go to Harvard in place of Anesaki. Binoy Babu wondered whether James Horton Woods's plans to bring professors from India to Harvard would bear any fruit. Binoy Kumar noted that the Venerable Prime Minister Okuma Shigenobu had emphasized education in the mother tongue when he founded Waseda University. At the same time, Waseda had appointed to its faculty Suboichi Shoyo, a translator of Shakespeare into Japanese, with whom Binoy Kumar discussed education and literature. Binoy Sarkar observed the high standing of three elders in Japanese society: Okuma Shigenobu, Inazo Nitobe, the author of Bushido, and Baron Shibusawa Eiichi, the captain of finance and industry. Having encountered Shibusawa at a meeting of the Japanese Association Concordia, Binoy Sarkar sought him out for an interview in his office. He learned that the restructuring of banking and finance had been the key first step in the economic modernization of Japan. By mid-August 1915, Binoy Babu mused, "What have I seen in Japan?" His reflections in answer to that question underscore a dramatic contrast between his travel experiences in Asia and Euro-America. In England and America, I understood the language of the people. I could converse with them in their mother tongue. Yet I felt oddly out of place, khapchara was the Bengali word used, in those societies. They too were unable to accept me as one of their own. I have not understood the language of the men and women of Japan. Yet standing on any street in any city or village, I have felt as if I have been watching the scenes of Calcutta. In their gait and look, their posture, their manner of speech, their laughter and humor, their modest and respectful demeanor, their customs of greeting and serving guests, in all these matters I have found India. In its heart and mind, Japan is a part of Asia. It has only imported some scraps of iron, lohalokkur, from Euro-America. Binoy Sarkar was admitted into the circle of scholars and artists in New York and Boston during 1914, 1915, and 1917 to 1919. Yet, it was his feeling oddly out of place, recorded candidly in his Bengali writing that was depicted in Florine Stettheimer's oil painting, Studio Party or Soiree. In it, Binoy Sarkar's still figure is placed as an exotic fig leaf in front of Florine's nude self-portrait on the wall of a studio, the venue of an animated avant-garde soiree. The awkwardness of Sarkar's pose, Monu Goswami has commented, belies the centrality of his placement. For Binoy Sarkar, it was not a pose. He felt awkward or khapchara in this milieu. The intellectual engagement with Euro-America and the affective bond with Asia represented distinct modes of internationalist belonging of a colonized Indian intent on shaping a new global future. What struck Binoy Sarkar on his arrival in China was that country's durdasha, misfortune. He dedicated his China travelogue to Kang Yu Wei and Liang Qiqiao, who deserved the reverence of young Asia. Among the Chinese intellectuals Binoy Sarkar met in Peking was Yan Fu, who had studied in Cambridge and translated Herbert Spencer and Adam Smith into Chinese. Another day, the Edinburgh-educated author of The Spirit of the Chinese People, Gu Hongming, sought Sarkar out in his hotel and held a lengthy discussion on Confucianism. At a Saturday gathering in an elite Shanghai club, Binoy Sarkar encountered Wu Ting Fang, the witty author of America Through the Eyes of an Oriental Diplomat, who inquired about theosophy and expressed a desire to visit Madras at war's end. Wu Ting Fang wrote the introduction to Binoy Sarkar's book, Chinese Religion Through Hindu Eyes, a study in the tendencies of Asiatic mentality. For insights into the psychology of intimacy evoked in early 20th century Asian encounters, one has to fall back on Binoy Sarkar's Bengali travel writing rather than his erudite scholarship in English. Most fascinating was what he had to say about Chinese Muslims and the role of Islam in undergirding Asian unity. Theorizing on this subject had come a long way from Okakura's emphasis on the Buddhist arc. Binoy Sarkar felt a much closer affinity to Chinese Muslim society than Chinese Buddhist society. In Japan and China, he had seen Buddhists and understood their historical relationship with India. But the music that sprang from my heart strings as soon as I encountered Muslims here, he wondered, why did it not sound on the same strings when I met the Chinese and Japanese Buddhist worshippers of Shakkoshingo? Maybe, Binoy Sarkar answered, India, and then in brackets, I cannot remember the four corners of that vast country, let me speak of Bengal, is not just Hindustan, it is also Musalmanistan. From a historical perspective, Hindustan was the land of Hindus, Parsis, Jains, Christians, Sikhs and Muslims. But for all practical purposes in the Bengali mind, Bharatvarsha was Hindu-Musalmanistan. In a lyrical passage, Binoy Sarkar went on to describe how from their birth Hindu friends played with Muslim friends and children of both faiths grew up together. After that, in bazaars, shops and markets, in grazing pastures and agricultural fields, in religious fairs and religious practices, in festivities and in distress, in famines and in cemeteries, Muslims were companions of Hindus, and Hindus were companions of Muslims. The blood and breath of Hindus and Muslims were inextricably mixed. The bond forged by this companionship, dwelling together, and brotherhood, Binoy Sarkar believed, was unbreakable. Far from harboring Hindu nationalist sentiments of the sort later propagated by V.D. Savarkar, or, quote, downplaying Islam as little more than a crude medieval political force preventing an Asian unity, unquote, as claimed by the historian Niall Green recently, Binoy Sarkar was an eloquent and passionate proponent of Hindu-Muslim equality and unity. On his return to India, he would become an ardent supporter of Deshabandhu Chittaranjan Das's 1923 Bengal Pact between Hindus and Muslims. In his address as President of the Indian National Congress on December 26, 1922, Deshabandhu envisioned the participation of India in the Great Asiatic Federation, which he saw in the course of formation. This was the first articulation of the vision of an Asiatic Federation from the highest echelons of the Congress. The swing in the pendulum back from an emphasis on Islamic to Asian universalism for oppressed nationalities was understandable in light of the rapid changes in Turkey. 1924 was a year of some importance for a series of Asian crossings and conversations. I go to China in what capacity I do not know, Rabindranath wrote to Roma Rola on February 24, 1924. Is it as a poet or as a bearer of good advice and sound common sense? Rabindranath's hesitation regarding which of his multiple identities to privilege would have some bearing on his reception in China. Liang Qiqiao welcomed Tagore at a grand reception. Not everyone was as warm and effusive as Liang in embracing Rabindranath. Guo Moruo launched a preemptive attack on Tagore as early as October 14, 1923, in Creation Weekly, before he could have known what the poet was going to present in China. An admirer and translator of Rabindranath's poetry during his years as a student in Japan, Guo Moruo was now concerned that Chinese youth might be misled by what he saw as Tagore's spiritualism. Lu Sun attended one of the lectures and sneered at the Chinese on the stage for wearing Indian headgear. There seems little doubt that these Chinese intellectuals displayed all the dogmatic zeal of fresh converts to a new religion called communism in fighting their battles against Rabindranath and his Chinese hosts. Despite the controversies generated by Rabindranath's visit in the realm of politics, Gal Givili has argued that the brief sojourn, along with the Tagorean influence more generally, served as a vehicle for the Chinese envisioning of Pan-Asian poetics. In Zhu Zimu's poem, Sunrise over Mount Tai, the debt to Tagore is obvious. Givili finds the ideal of Pan-Asian poetics in its most realized form in the work of Bing Xin, who grasped intuitively Tagore's conception of the harmony between the individual, soul, and the universe, and gave expression to it in an interpersonal poetic form, for instance, in her 1925 poem, Yarning. Yet to interpret Rabindranath as a poet of Asian spirituality against Western materialism, as this scholar Givili does, is to take a blinkered view of his literary genius. Unfortunately, Tagore did not get the Nobel Prize for his greatest poetry, and Chinese poets, translators, and critics in the 1910s and 1920s were limited to English versions of his Bengali poems, mostly from Gitanjali. Tagore's finest modern poetry, celebrating life, love, women, and the wonders of this world, was to be composed later in 1924 and in early 1925 to appear in his book Purobi, which he rendered as the East in its feminine gender. Rabindranath's visit also facilitated interactions in the domain of art. He had imagined his China based on Chinese works of art, marvels of beauty shown to him by his Japanese host in 1916. During the 1924 visit, his artist companion, Nandolal, had opportunities to meet Chinese painters like Qi Baishi, Chen Banding, and Yao Mangfu. He created picture postcards with his own sketches, took photographs, and created a work of art as a gift for the dancer Mei Lanfang, who performed the famous Goddess of the Low River on the occasion of Rabindranath's farewell from Peking. Tagore's message of the intrinsic relationship between beauty and hospitality had a friendlier reception in Japan than in China. In Japan, the Asian universalist turn in the domain of art was alive and well. Nandolal had the privilege of being hosted by Kampo Arai, as well as Rabindranath's friend Taikan, and was introduced to masterpieces of Japanese art. Rabindranath made a final visit to East Asia on his way back from the United States in 1929. He was especially grateful for the shelter of Japanese hospitality in May 1929 after a humiliating encounter with US immigration officials in Los Angeles. The captain and crew of the Japanese ship Tayomaru observed the poet's 68th birthday on May 6, 1929, with a grand celebration. On board the ship, Rabindranath composed a poem titled A Weary Pilgrim for the Asahi Shinbun. Send thy welcome signal, O rising sun, open the golden gate at the ancient shrine of the East, where dwells the spirit of man, great as the grass that blesses the lowly dust, and meek as the mountain under stars. Once in Japan, he called for Japanese statesmanship to be conducted with sympathy and understanding towards its weaker neighbors. Rabindranath's stopover in Vietnam on his way home in June 1929 was reminiscent of his mixed reception in China 5 years earlier. Once again, the poet seemed to have admirers and detractors in almost equal measure. Quite a few literary and political figures embraced Tagore in their quest to find a place for Vietnam in a larger anti-colonial entity named Asia. His critics derided what they saw as his elitism and opulent lifestyle, symbolized by his willingness to drink champagne, which set him apart from subaltern or underground Asian networks. Soon after his departure for India, 2 poems were published in the journal Duoc Na Nam, Vietnamese Flame, giving him a stellar position in a shared Asian cultural ecumene. The second poem would have warmed Tagore's heart. 1,000 autumns as the bearded wise man, I have long heard words about you, Tagore. Only now can I see you here. You are a star of the Asian sky. This was just before the dark clouds of the Great Depression appeared on the Asian firmament. If the streams of Asian universalism and communist internationalism diverged from 1927 onwards, as Tim Harper has shown in his book Underground Asia, the intertwining of Asian and Islamic universalisms had a much longer afterlife than might have been expected following the Turkish abolition of the Khilafat in 1924. The Khilafat Committee continued to function, and Muhammad Ali Johar attended the first Mu'tamar al-Alam al-Islami, World Islamic Conference at Mecca in December 1926. At Muhammad Ali's funeral in Jerusalem in January 1931, his elder brother, Shaukat Ali, and the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, Haj Muhammad Amin al-Husseini, decided to convene a second World Islamic Conference. No one gave more eloquent expression to a different universalism of Muslims in South and West Asia than the great poet-philosopher Muhammad Iqbal, who attended the second Mu'tamar al-Alam al-Islami at Jerusalem in November 1931. Aisha Jalal points out that Iqbal regretted that the spirit of Islamic universalism had been misconstrued in Europe as something akin to the Yellow Peril in an interview to the Bombay Chronicle during his Indian Ocean voyage in September 1931. The spectre of pan-Islamism had been conjured up in the fertile imagination of a lone French journalist. A travesty of Muslim sentiments in favor of unity against European aggression, Iqbal proposed dropping pan from the phrase, as Islamism sufficed to convey the Muslim desire for a faith-based solidarity that was more of a social experiment than the political project Europeans imagined it to be. Much the same could be said at this time about the needless prefix attached to the sentiments of Asianism. The Jerusalem Conference met during the depths of the Great Depression, which was forcing debt-ridden Palestinian peasants to sell their lands to European Zionists. In his farewell address delivered in English on December 14, 1931, Iqbal urged Muslims to meet the twin challenges of materialism and nationalism by seeking spiritual unity across borders. Rabindranath traveled to West Asia in April and May 1932. In his book Paroshe, he spelled out in the clearest terms his vision of Asian universalism. He visited the graves of Sadi and Hafiz in Shiraz and claimed kinship with these Persian poets whose religious sensibility taught the lesson of transcending bigotry. For the English reading public, Rabindranath wrote an article in the Modern Review later in the year titled Asia's Response to the Call of the New Age. He sensed an epochal moment in the history of humanity. Perhaps in the drama of Europe, the scene is being changed for the fifth act of the play. Signs of an awakening in Asia have slowly spread from one end of the horizon to the other. The glow of the new dawn above the eastern mountain ranges of humanity is indeed a great vision. It is a vision of freedom. Tagore's friend, Charles Freer Andrews, expressed a similar sentiment in an article on Asia in Revolution. In the same issue of the journal in October 1932, based on a lecture he gave at the University of Cambridge, Andrews observed the entire continent of Asia in the throes of a vast revolution. The economic depression in Europe and America, he noted astutely, has had an intimate relation to the events which are happening in India and the Far East. The theme of the rise of nationalism captured merely a superficial aspect of the Asian revolt. A deeper analysis revealed, first, an almost entire reaction in Asia against European domination, and second, the uprising at last of the downtrodden peasantry of agricultural Asia against age-long tyranny and oppression. The shared feeling of abjection from being at the receiving end of white racism in Asian and African colonies, quite as much as in the United States of America, created bonds among oppressed peoples, but also a tendency to overlook forms of oppression that did not follow racial lines. In December 1936, W.E.B. Du Bois, the renowned African-American intellectual and fighter for racial justice, arrived in Japan to a warm official and non-official reception. Through him, Du Bois believed Japan was extending to 12 million African Americans a message of a common brotherhood, a common destiny. He gave a series of lectures in Osaka, Kobe, and Tokyo on a wide variety of subjects, including Frederick Douglass and African American literature. Upon his return to the United States, he was prepared to explain away Japan's aggression against China with some realist political analysis. The First World War and the Great Depression, he argued, made it impossible for Europe to pursue her Asiatic plans. Unless, therefore, Japan took advantage of this breathing spell and made herself dominant in China, she would surrender China eventually to Europe. In his opinion, the Chinese owed, quote, their chance for independence today to the fight of Japan against European aggression, unquote. Yono Noguchi had long heard the call of the Ganga. He had learned about India from Sarojini Naidu early in the 20th century and had been fascinated with the poetry and politics of both Ireland and India. Noguchi had close interactions with Tagore and his entourage in 1916, 1924, and 1929, and had been repeatedly invited to India. He at long last set sail for India on October 17, 1935, arriving to a warm welcome in Calcutta on November 10, 1935. In a poem in his book, The Ganges Calls Me, he wrote, "Away from agony and thought, at last the Bengal Bay sets my head and foot attune to the low humming of rest." Noguchi's itinerary in South Asia for nearly 3 months during the winter of 1935-36 was anything but restful. His old literary friend Sarojini Naidu welcomed him in her home at Hyderabad. Noguchi was given an audience by Mahatma Gandhi in his ashram at Sevagram. A connoisseur of Japanese dance, Noguchi met the dancer Uday Shankar in Bombay and enjoyed his performance. When he visited the home of Sarala Devi Chaudhurani, he found the paintings of Kali and Saraswati by Taikkan and Hishida Shunso that her mother had purchased in 1903 still hanging on the walls. The high point of Noguchi's visit was the ceremonial reception accorded to him in the mango grove of Shantiniketan on November 30th, 1935. Everyone stood up when Rabindranath's song Janagana Mano Adhinayako, an ode to Bharata Bhagya Vidhata, was performed in chorus. In his address, Rabindranath recalled his first visit to Japan, where he received a welcome extravagant in its lavishness. "At last the poet has come," Rabindranath said to Noguchi, "the poet who is the true messenger of the spirit of his people, representing the culture which is national, but above all universal and of all time." Rabindranath offered his words as India's greetings to Noguchi, and through him to his nation, which is newborn in a new age, which is ready to claim the crown of deathless glory from the dispenser of human destiny. Destiny decreed a different denouement. After Japan's invasion of China, Subhash Chandra Bose, president of the Indian National Congress, sent an Indian medical mission to China. In his farewell message to the mission, Subhash Chandra referred to the history of intimate and cordial relations between India and China, urging its members to link up with another oppressed nation. Like the Indian missionaries of old, our medical men are now going out to China as ambassadors of service, goodwill, and love. The medical mission set sail on SS Rajputana from Bombay on September 1st, 1938. On the same day, Rabindranath sat down in Shantiniketan to compose his reply to a letter he had received from Noguchi. Neither its temper nor its contents harmonize with the spirit of Japan, he wrote, which I learned to admire in your writings and came to love through my personal contacts with you. Noguchi had professed that Japan's only enemy was the Kuomintang government, a miserable puppet of the West, whose leader, Chiang Kai-shek, had sold his country to the West for nothing. Rabindranath, by contrast, saw the aggression as a war on Chinese humanity with all the deadly methods learned from the West. And today I understand more than ever before, he concluded, the meaning of the enthusiasm with which the big-hearted Japanese thinker Okakura assured me that China is great. Noguchi wrote once more to say that no one in Japan denied the greatness of the Chinese people, and that Japan was only correcting the mistaken idea of Chiang Kai-shek, and that Chiang's China was far more military than Japan. Noguchi asserted that he was never a eulogist of Japanese militarism because he had many differences with it. Rabindranath responded with sorrow and shame, not anger, that he could no longer point out with pride the example of a great Japan. He conceded that there were no better standards prevalent anywhere else, and that the so-called civilized peoples of the West were proving equally barbarous. He ended by wishing the Japanese people whom he loved not success but remorse. Noguchi may have been correct in his assessment of Chiang Kai-shek, but in this exchange of poets, there seemed little doubt that Tagore had occupied the higher ethical ground. Meanwhile, in 1940, a Chinese artist, Xu Beihong, who in his youth had trained in both Japan and France, taught for several months in Shantiniketan at Tagore's invitation, and interacted with Abanindranath, Nandalal, and Binod Bihari Mukherjee. The idyllic atmosphere of Tagore's Shantiniketan enchanted Xu. The mango trees laden with clusters of fruit, the fiery silk cotton flowers, the indefatigable soft-voiced singing of birds, together with Tagore's refined speech and demeanor, were to live forever in Beihong's memory. He painted Tagore's portrait, which you see, and sketched Gandhi during the Mahatma's visit to Shantiniketan in February 1940. From Shantiniketan, Xu traveled up to the hill station of Darjeeling, where he captured the magic of the Himalayas in ink and oils. How did the artistic milieu in Shantiniketan, that had served as a hub of an Asian cultural ecumene, respond to war and famine in the 1940s? Nandalal, the painter who had the closest acquaintance with Japanese and Chinese art, did not depict the horrors of famine in his home province. That was left to his younger contemporaries, Somnath Hor and Ramkinkar Bej in Shantiniketan, and to Jainul Abidin and Chittaprasad elsewhere in Bengal. There is, however, a deep sense of irony in his painting Annapurna, which he created in 1943, the year of the Great Bengal Famine. In a combination of tempera and Japanese wash, he created the haunting Annapurna and Rudra. Annapurna, who is seated on a lotus, holds a bowl of rice in her hands. Before her stands Shiva, reduced to a skeleton, holding a begging bowl. Gazing at the Shingawa Gulf from the home of the central bank governor Shibusawa Shakuro in November 1943, Subhash Chandra Bose reflected on the achievements of Meiji Japan and its 1905 victory, much as Binoy Kumar Sarkar had done in 1915. On November 3rd, he visited the Meiji Shrine to pay his respects on the anniversary of the adoption of the Meiji Constitution. Before the Greater East Asia Conference began, Subhash Chandra Bose made sure paintings and poetry that had helped forge bonds between India and Japan since the turn of the 20th century would figure prominently on his itinerary. He visited the Ueno Museum of Art with Ananda Mohan Sohai and Abid Hassan. Having learnt that his war cry, Chalo Delhi, had inspired the composition of a Japanese song by Noguchi for NHK titled Marching to Delhi, he asked for and received an English translation. The first verse of this song poem, in 4 verses, visualized a freedom feast in the land of famine. Delhi, Delhi to Delhi, the war cry replies to a storm of cannonballs and praises the might of powder and smoke, Leap over the terror that trenches command, and entrust your bones to a hill of the motherland. In a blazing sand your palm grasps, you will find all the rewards that death bestows, and the hunger you suffered from the hundreds of years can't be filled till an independence feast is spread. On the eve of Indian independence, an Asian Relations Conference was convened in Delhi by a poet-politician, Sarojini Naidu. She had missed presiding over the All-Asian Women's Conference in 1931 since she was jailed for taking part in Gandhi's civil disobedience movement. 16 years on, as soon as she rose to address her comrades and kindreds of Asia, who had come to take an indestructible pledge of the unity of Asia, the audience erupted in applause. And what will Asia do with her Renaissance, she asked. Sarojini Naidu knew that this gathering of Asians had raised suspicions in the minds of leaders of the West. How great a compliment that is, she commented wryly, to one poor woman who signs a humble invitation that she should symbolize red to centuries of Western civilization. She made a compelling case for the great diversity of Asian culture, having cemented the unity of the Asian people. Who wants a monotonous culture? She declaimed. Who wants a uniform culture? Who wants a colorless culture? It was a colorful cosmopolitanism that would bring Asians together. She articulated a clear-eyed, if idealistic, vision for the future. Asia shall not be a country of enemies. Asia shall be a country of fellowship of the world. For skeptics who reckoned the aspiration aimed too high, beyond the realm of possibility, she had an answer. The birds have said, "Why do you cry for the moon?" We do not cry for the moon. We pluck it from the skies and wear it upon the diadem of Asia's freedom. The deliberations were accompanied by cultural exhibitions. An inter-Asian art exhibition featured 200 paintings by Abanindranath, Nandalal, Ashit Haldar, Sardar Ukil, Jamini Rai, and Abdurrahman Chugtai. Japan may have been absent at the conference, but a Japanese brush drawing, Fish, by Kakemonos, proved to be a major attraction for delegates and visitors alike. Nearly 20,000 delegates and guests gathered at the Purana Killa for the closing plenary session on the evening of April 2nd, 1947, for a true celebration of Asian fellow feeling. It was left to none other than Mahatma Gandhi to provide a sobering climax to the proceedings. He had already dropped in the day before and lamented the shameful inability of Indians to keep the peace among themselves. Gandhi described himself as Mountbatten and Nehru's prisoner in Delhi, as violence of religiously defined majorities against minorities careered out of control. Do not carry the memory of that carnage beyond the confines of India, he begged the foreign visitors. It was as if it had nothing to do with the true spirit of Asia. In an assertion of innate faith, he proclaimed, Asia has to conquer the West. The message of Asia is not to be learned through European spectacles, he argued, not by imitating the vices of the West, its gunpowder and atom bomb. He ended with a stirring call to deliver the world, and not just Asia, from wickedness and sin. It fell once more to the indomitable Sarojini Naidu to conclude the conference on an uplifting note. She envisioned a federation of free peoples as the gold of Asian consciousness. Earlier in the day, the leader of the Chinese delegation had issued an invitation to the second Asian Relations Conference to be held in 2 years' time in China. I thought of what the Prophet of Islam had said so beautifully, Sarojini Naidu remarked. Go even as far as China to seek knowledge. Fellow Asians, she urged, together march forward to the dawn. 2 years later, China was in the throes of its communist revolution. The Second Asian Relations Conference was never held. But that did not mean the idea of Asia was dead. Writing a year after the conference, in the inaugural issue of the journal United Asia, George Catlin, the renowned British political thinker, recalled the magnificent oratory of Mrs. Naidu. What prospect is there, he asked, that this high hope will be realized and that Asia will remain united? What would the Renaissance of Asia come to mean? On the eve of May Day, 1952, K.T. Shah, the Indian opposition's candidate for president, who had been a very close follower of Subhash Chandra Bose, encountered Liu Shaoqi, a vice chairman of the People's Republic, who came across as extremely well-informed, well-mannered, and soft-spoken. From a peasant background and through work in labor organizations, Liu Shaoqi had emerged as the high priest of the theoretical communism in China. The high priest the following morning was, of course, Mao Zedong. The song, "The East is aglow, the sun is rising, China has brought forth a Mao Zedong," competed in popularity with the national anthem. Taken as a whole, K.T. Shah observed, the parade was a magnificent, inspiring spectacle. It combined Goebbels' artistry with Gandhiji's sincerity. But he had no doubt that the masses had many causes for genuine satisfaction besides the mere hysteria of the moment. In Shah's view, early post-1949 China appeared to be doing better than early post-1947 India on the question of federalism. While the common program in China postulates democratic centralism and yet provides for such considerable autonomy for local governing bodies, he observed, we in India talk of real democracy and yet so effectively centralize the real power, authority, and resources of government as to make of provincial autonomy or municipal and village self-government a tragic farce. The political economist was not uninterested in the question of culture. In Shanghai, he was treated to a superbly acted stage performance of The White-Haired Girl. They say this has been made into a picture, he wrote, but I was glad I saw the real performance by a mistress of her art rather than a pale reflection in a mechanical reproduction. Just as Shah was being received at Bombay Central Station on June 5, 1952, by enthusiasts eager to learn about his experiences in the new old world, D.D. Kosambi, a brilliant Indian historian and polymath, was attending a meeting of the preparatory committee in Beijing of an Asia-Pacific Peace Conference that was to be convened from October 2nd to 10th, 1952. On September 12th, 1952, Du Bois sent his warmest congratulations to the conference organizers. I have seen Asia but once in 1936, when I visited China and Japan, he explained, and realized the leadership of the people of Asia in numbers, in hard work, and in antiquity of culture over all the peoples of the world. His own people, whom he described as the untouchables of this land, held out their hands to Asia, applauding the People's Republic of China, the independence of India and Pakistan, and the struggle in Burma and Indochina to achieve a new freedom and democracy. A mural copy of Diego Rivera's The Nightmare of War and the Dream of Peace had adorned the conference hall in Beijing on June 6, 1952, the final day of the preparatory meeting for the October gathering. The conference itself, as Rachel Liao has perceptively argued, played a crucial role in the emotional making of an internationalism that stretched from Asia to Africa and Latin America. The leader of the Indian delegation and veteran freedom fighter Saifuddin Kichlu presented a Kashmiri lacquer box to his Pakistani counterpart, Pir Manki Sharif, who in turn put a gold cap on his Punjabi brother Kichlu's head. Kichlu and Sharif garlanded Guomoruo, who had brought them together. Louis Wheaton, an African-American labor leader, read out a joint India-Pakistan declaration on Kashmir, squarely placing the blame for the dispute on Anglo-American machinations and the ineptitude of the United Nations. Delegates stood on their chairs and wildly cheered the signing of the declaration. The members of the two delegations hugged and kissed, and the Indian and Pakistani women showered each other with flower petals. Besides such effusive, publicly expressed affection, there were quieter opportunities for Asians to learn from one another. The artist, Maqbool Fida Hussain, was one of the 60 Indian delegates at the Asia-Pacific Peace Conference. Hussain was honored to meet Chibai Shi, the master of ink painting, whom he held in the highest respect and described as the Matisse of Asia. The other Chinese artist to make a powerful impression on Hussain was none other than Xu Beihong, who in 1940 had spent several months in Rabindranath's Shantiniketan. It was in India that his depiction of horses took on a new life as he rode them all the way to Kashmir. A dozen years later, in Xu's studio, Hussain was mesmerized by a gigantic canvas of 1,000 horses, each of which was imbued with grace and power. Xu's example inspired Hussain to lend new vigor to his own horses. Artistic genius had vaulted across the Himalayas. On July 26, 1953, at 8 in the evening, the curtains lifted for a cultural performance by a visiting Indian delegation in Peking's Hoping Peace Hall. The Indians began by singing in chorus Bande Mataram, the famous ode to their motherland. The patriotic prelude was followed by an overture to their hosts as Debobrata Biswas of Bengal and Surinder Kaur of Punjab sang in duet Hindi Chini Bhai Bhai, composed by Harindranath Chattopadhyay in celebration of the brotherhood of Indians and Chinese. Among the large audience was the top leadership of the People's Republic of China, with Chairman Mao Zedong in his trademark blue coat sitting unobtrusively in the fourth row. The penultimate item on the 20-course feast of Indian music and dance was a Bengali song poem written by Sukanta Bhattacharya. As Debobrata Biswas rendered the immortal lines of this inspiring song, Bidroho Aaj, Bidroho Charidike, the young Chinese stage manager synchronized flashes of red light that enveloped the hall. The Prime Minister, Chou En-lai, hosted a grand banquet following the concert that had concluded with a Kathakali dance. "Aren't you the one who performed the revolutionary songs?" Chou En-lai asked Debobrata Biswas with a warm smile and a warmer handshake as he trooped into the banquet hall with his fellow artists. "Wonderful, wonderful. You must perform these songs wherever you go," Chou En-lai urged the Bengali singer. Debobrata Biswas had expressed a wish to meet the famous painter Chibai Shi, for whom Tagore had great admiration and had met in 1924. His Chinese hosts obliged by bringing the 93-year-old artist from his village to a disciple's home in Peking. Accompanied by the dancer Chandralekha, Debobrata Biswas set off for a memorable meeting with Chibai Shi, who was delighted to learn that he had not only come from Tagore's land, but sang Tagore's songs. Having seen numerous pictures of tractors in the new China, George Biswas broached the subject of socialist realism in art. "Is China going to obliterate its great tradition in the fine arts," he asked, "and be satisfied with depicting war and machinery?" Chibai Shi laughed and acknowledged the utility of realism as a mode of instruction for peasants and laborers. He himself still took inspiration from nature. Asking his student to prepare some color for him, he picked up a bamboo brush and produced for his Indian guests an exquisite painting of a lobster. Debobrata Biswas returned from the encounter pondering over the concept of socialist realism in art and gifted the lobster to Chandralekha, who was effusive in its praise. In Tientsin, Debobrata Biswas persuaded the sitar maestro Vilayat Khan to join him in presenting Rabindranath's popular song Tomar Holo Shuru, Amar Holo Shara, that promised a beginning at every end. Vilayat's prelude and interlude in the Iman Raga took Debobrata's vocal presentation to new heights. Debobrata Biswas commented that the fierce individualism of Indian classical musicians had been leavened by China's example of collective creativity. In Shanghai, a new element was added to the cultural performance, with Damayanti Joshi dancing to Debobrata Biswas's rendering of Rabindranath's Nrittero Tale Tale. With the rhythm of your dance, O Nataraj, make me free from all bonds, wake me up from sleep, let the rhythm of your bond-free song fill my heart. Debobrata Biswas titled the presentation Liberation of Man, and as anticipated, the Chinese audience roared their appreciation with calls for an encore. On the evening of August 15, 1953, as the Indians prepared to leave Shanghai for Hangzhou, a most astonishing scene unfolded on the railway platform. A bunch of Chinese young men and women asked Debobrata Biswas to sing Hindi Chini, and soon everyone joined in. What followed was a cyclonic dance with the Chinese and Indians holding hands. The classical vocalist, Master Krishnan from Bombay, slipped and fell, but that did not deter him from swaying to the rhythm of the song as he squatted on the platform. On the flight back home, Debobrata Biswas noticed tears flowing down the cheeks of Murthy, the mridango player from Madras, as he looked wistfully out of the plane's window, and his China diary lay open on his lap. Less than a decade after the expression of this bonhomie, India and China would be fighting a border war in the Himalayas. The slide from solidarity to animosity had much to do with the inability of new citizens to effect change through the realization of anti-colonial aspirations and the tendency of managers of states to opt for post-colonial continuity in the definition of sovereignty and borders. The inheritances from colonizing Europe ultimately proved weightier than the legacies of the best in anti-colonial Asian thought. Yet, in conclusion, I must say that even at that moment of rivalry and conflict between Asian nation-states, an intellectual quest began to discover what a Japanese scholar of modern Chinese literature, Takeuchi Yoshimi, evocatively called in a 1960 lecture, Asia as Method. The values of freedom and equality propagated by the West, Takeuchi argued, had been sustained by colonial invasion, thereby weakening them. Poets like Tagore and Lucan had grasped this point intuitively and felt it was their duty to achieve global equality. Takeuchi called upon Asia to re-embrace and change the West, since only such a rollback of culture or values would create universality. It is significant that in the 1960s, Japanese art in the domain of culture enabled the spirit of Asian universalism to survive the wartime depredations of Japanese nationalistic imperialism. One example was Nandalal Bose's celebration of the Indian countryside in his art, creatively drawing on the Japanese sumie style. Economy cannot be easily mapped onto the domain of culture. Yet the economic threshold of 1979, signaling the so-called rise of Asia, also marked, as CJWV has noted, a dramatic increase in cultural production, ranging from visual art exhibitions to bilingual or multilingual films to pop music, which circulated intensely within the region and aimed to define a multicultural intra-Asian culture. The 1979 Fukuoka exhibition assembled art from India, China, and Japan under the sign of Okakura Tenshin. The 2002 Tokyo exhibition, celebrating connections rather than comparisons and setting aside any search for national identity, was organized under the sign of Takeuchi Yoshimi. 4 decades before he was invoked at the exhibition, Takeuchi had urged Asian countries to transcend the confines of nation and state to jointly address particularly urgent issues. Japan continues to inspire fresh departures in South Asian art as it did just over 100 years ago. One luminous example is the bridge from Shahid Jalal's exhibition, Memories of Japan, that opened in Lahore in May 2022. In his 1932 essay, Asia's Response to the Call of the New Age, Rabindranath Tagore had declared, "What I say is that if Asia is not fully awakened, then there is no deliverance for Europe as well. The fatal arrow for Europe lies in the weakness of Asia." He could see there was no longer any respect for Europe across the length and breadth of the Asian continent. It is impossible for Asia today to lower her prestige before Europe, he wrote. Because of the latter's prestige, nothing remains but military browbeating. Then came a reflection and a warning. Once I went out to Eastern Asia to welcome there the birth of the new spirit of humanity. There in the easternmost sky of Asia was fluttering the triumphant banner of Japan, encouraging new hope in the heart of Asia. I experienced joy, yet my mind was deeply disturbed. What followed in Tagore's essay remains as relevant today as it was in 1932, even though the identity of the Asian country flaunting triumphalism has changed. The presumptive leader of Asia had not learned the art of civilization, which heals and unites, but had trained her hands under Europe in the science that inflicts wounds with efficiency. The calamity to which I refer is tragic, the poet wrote in grim prose, not merely because of its political consequences, but for its cruel destruction of human possibilities. Can Asia, after Europe, save itself and the world from such a calamitous fate? Rising to that challenge would require a determined reimagination of a pluralized continentalism. That power of imagination lies well within the range of the best attributes of Asian universalism that I have described today, that can expand and not destroy the aspirations of humanity. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Bose. It was a seamless movement across history, politics, art, and literature. And we were mesmerized. And the wonderful thing was this presentation of Pan-Asianism that you did. This is something remarkable, because most of us are so used to a kind of Eurocentric thought process. So this was absolutely remarkable, interesting, riveting. Any word I use is going to fall short of really describing the import of what you shared with us. And I'm so honored that you felt you could share your yet unpublished book with this audience. So I think a round of applause for Professor Bose for thinking us an appropriate audience to share his thoughts. Thank you, sir, so much. And now I will hand over the microphone to Professor Srimoyi Guha-Thakurta. She will handle the question answer session.
Thank you, Dr. Chatterjee. And on my behalf, may I again thank Professor Bose for being with us today. And from a student of history, sir, today's lecture was absolutely wonderful, literally and figuratively. Thank you so much. Now it's time for our questions. I will request everyone who has a question to raise their hand so that our student Ambareen can reach them. But before that, when you ask a question, please introduce yourself first and limit yourself to one question. If necessary, we can come back to you. Sir, will you be taking one question at a time, or will you be taking 2 or 3 questions together?
Let's take 2 or 3 for the interest of
Okay, okay. All right. Okay then. Yes.
Hello, sir. I am Moinak Bhattacharya. I am from semester 5 and the Department of History. Sir, I had a clarification regarding the link between politics and the concept of Asian universalism. Sir, was there a particular consistent political model that proponents of Asian universalism saw as ideal, or which would perhaps help in the vision of a unified Asia? Or was there a parallel or a separate development of culture with regard to politics?
Good afternoon, sir. Good afternoon, sir. I am Ishita again from Sem 1 History Department. I would like to ask I would like to ask 2 questions. That what was the reaction of the common people that Indian art elements were being incorporated in the paintings of Abanindranath Tagore and many other his contemporaries? And second question, I want to ask that what did the government after the post-independence do to promote Indian art and music, especially in the formal diplomatic receptions by with other countries? And given the soft power of of India in the present scenario, do you think that there would be any chance to revive the Indian art elements and music?
Okay. Yes, sir.
Right. Both have asked insightful questions. First of all, I don't think we can talk in terms of a singular mode of Asian solidarity. You know, as I moved through time, beginning around 1902-3, sort of the start of the 20th century, through the decades into the 1950s, what you might have grasped is that there were certain shifts that were taking place. At the very outset, I think there was an attempt at a cultural quest for an Asian universalism, and that may be seen to be not overtly political. And I think it's quite important to emphasize that this quest for Asian universalism began before the landmark event of Japan's military victory over Russia in 1905. In fact, in my book, I start around 1880, even though for this lecture, I talked about Taikan's visit following Okakura's in 1903. But then, the global context matters. And the First World War provided opportunities for Asian revolutionaries to try and coordinate in launching a challenge to European imperial powers, the British and the French and the Dutch. And that's why I think you find that you have, at that point, a mobilization of various subaltern networks. I briefly mentioned Tim Harper's book, Underground Asia. There's a wonderful section in that on the Singapore Mutiny of 1915 and so forth. And then if you look at the 1920s, the point that I would emphasize is that nationalism, anti-colonial nationalism, was never fully constrained by the borders of the colony or the imagined nation. There were always extraterritorial dimensions to that kind of anti-colonialism. And what I'm suggesting here was that Asian universalism was one such effort to look beyond the boundaries of the nation. But there were others too. which is why for the 1920s, I was hinting at the intermingling of an Asian universalism with an Islamic universalism, with communist internationalism, and so forth. And naturally, when you look at the 1930s, you have to take account of the global economic crisis of the Depression. And once we get into the period of the Second World War, what we find is that what could not be achieved in the First World War was in the end accomplished in the period of the Second World War during another opportunity provided by an international war crisis. But I also pointed out that Asia could be as immune to nationalist, could be sort of as not immune to nationalist conflicts as Europe. And that's why, for example, the Japan-China conflict of 1937 undermined the quest for Asian universalism, but not fully, because these attempts continued, as I tried to show in my lecture, through the 1940s and even the first decade after independence and the communist revolution through the 1950s. So I think as historians, we have to be attentive to shifts over time, and that there could have been, multiple articulations of a quest for an Asian solidarity. Okay, so that's the other question is that I think I was emphasizing the effective bond between Asias, and there, the themes that I picked up for today's lecture. Art, poetry, music, all of this really mattered. And it wasn't just, the upper crust of anti-colonial politics, Asian solidarity. There was a deeper cultural dialogue that was going on, across Asia throughout this period. Now, when you ask about the common people, in the book, I look at both elite and subaltern networks. But as soon as we focus on, art, poetry, music, to some degree we are talking about, educated elites, their conversations. And, one of the strategies that I was adopting today was to follow particular figures, some who are quite famous, others I was trying to rescue from undeserved oblivion, like Binoy Kumar Sarkar, for example, and looking at how they reappear in these different phases that I was talking about. There is Noguchi of 1915 welcoming Binoy Sarkar in his home. There is a Noguchi of 1935, Binta coming to India, and so on. So again, I think that it's not possible to, do everything in one lecture. So for today, I was probably focusing a bit more on elite networks. But I think this Asian idea was something that actually encompassed many classes, many genders, and multiple genders, and so forth. So we need to. I am less really concerned about state-led diplomacy. In fact, what I find fascinating about the search for an Asianism or Asianisms is that it has been less state-driven than the move towards European integration. In fact, some of the crises that you see in Europe today can partly be explained by the fact that this idea of the European Union was much too state-driven, much too bureaucratically organized, and in some ways it would be better if the quest for some kind of a shared, Asian cultural acumen, a shared political posture that is not prisoner to the nation-state idea with which we have been living for 100 years now, since the end of the First World War, was less defined by managers of states. In fact, I see managers of states potentially undermining these movements of Asian solidarity. And so even though it would be necessary for political elites to also accept some of this idea of achieving Asian understanding, it probably would be better if it is not entirely controlled by managers of states and political elites.
Thank you, sir. Yes, sir. I think Vice Principal should have the
No, you have mainly focused on, nicely focused on Asianness and forms of Asian universalism. But at the same time, that's my area of curiosity, that since the 1940s we see a consolidation of Asian nation states on European model. So these two incompatibles were happening together. You gave some hints already in your discussion now, but still that is where I am really eager to know that Asian nation states on European model, they are coming up post-colonial since the 1940s. But at the same time, since 100 years back, we see that there are efforts, attempts at having Asianness and forms of Asian universalism. So how to find some, what should I say, answer to this kind of incompatibles?
So would you take a couple of more questions? Sure. Then a show of hands. Yes, Ambarin. Okay, Chandan.
Sir, I am Chandan Kumar Pal from Department of Chemistry. So, in the last century, we have seen weapons of mass destruction, and Asia was worstly affected. How does it reflect in the art forms, poetry, music, etc.? And was there any conversation really?
One more maybe in the back. Give it to Dipto first. Okay.
Sir, I am Dipto Gangopadhyay from Department of History, Semester 5. So my question is, you spoke on the Asian solidarity part. My question is that for Asia, what I understood is you are meaning the southeastern part, you're meaning India, you even took China, and to some extent you also spoke about the Muslim faction. We can see in India certain instances where both Hindus and Muslims are communicating. I shouldn't be using such terms, but then again, we are seeing Iqbal is writing Javednama in 30s, and he's drawing inspiration from Buddha, Zarathustra, and then going on with Muhammad. So I can see that there was an attempt of Asian solidarity in India. Abanindranath Tagore is borrowing Mughal miniatures, improvising Bengali miniature in a very Persianist style. But from the Muslim world's part, how did they reciprocate and how did they inculcate the pagan elements in their art and culture and poetry? That was my question, sir.
Okay. What the Vice Principal raised was the crux of the matter. There were these visions of, what independent Asia should look like in, shall we say, the first half of the 20th century, which were in two very important ways different from the model of the European nation state. In Europe, you can see the age of territoriality begin at somewhere around 1860. One doesn't need to go far back to Westphalia. And certainly after the end of the First World War, the nation-state form is being propagated as the norm. But I don't think that it was internalized in anti-colonial thought across many Asian colonies. And when I say it was different in two ways, one is that there was a sense that each colony was characterized by various measures of diversity, cultural, linguistic, religious diversity. Therefore, those differences had to be accommodated. There had to be some kind of a federal union, let's say in India. Otherwise, you would have to simply think in terms of an over-centralized state monolith. That was one, accommodation of internal diversity. It is often forgotten that even in China, there was a trend towards that. And early Mao Zedong was talking about an independent state of Hunan. You know, very different from the Mao Zedong of the 1950s, who is leading a party state and trying to, clamp down on, moves towards provincial autonomy. He goes in that direction from the late 1950s. So there's this question of the internal sort of diversity. The other is to transcend the borders of each colony or nation to be, to think in terms of something like an Asiatic federation. And as I mentioned, the first call came from Bengali leader, Deshabandhu Chittaranjan Das. But in my book, I write extensively about Sun Yat-sen, for example, of China. And even at the moment of the post-colonial transition, a whole range of people, whether it's Aung San of Burma or Ho Chi Minh of Vietnam and so on, they were thinking in terms of some kind of a larger Asiatic federation. But it is true that ultimately, in some ways, the European nation-state model won out. And one of the reasons for all these conflicts that we see today, even in Asia, is that Asia lost sight of its alternative forms of universalism and did not, in fact, follow Tagore's advice that if Asia is to rise, it has to speak in its own authentic voice and not imitate the beastly cry of Europe. Unfortunately, Asia has ended up, in many instances, just imitating the beastly cry of European nation-states. So this is the tension. I mean, when the title Asia After Europe is not just about Asia after the European imposition of colonial domination. It's also a book about trying to see whether, conceptually, we can build an Asia after Europe that is not completely constrained by European reference of what political forms should look like, and whether some Asian ideas can have some play. The question about art, yes, in terms of weapons of mass destruction, yes, you find a lot of it in Asian art. I, of course, gave only one example today, where Diego Rivera, the great Mexican artist, a mural copy of his famous painting, The Nightmare of War and the Dream of Peace, was being displayed as a background of an Asia-Pacific, peace conference. And so, at least in the immediate post-independence period, post-independence period for India, post-communist revolution period for China, but there were many other parts of Asia which were still under colonial rule in the 1950s, where Merdeka had not come to Malaysia or Singapore and so on. So there was particularly there was a sense of what had happened in Japan with the dropping of the atom bombs, but there was a huge concern of what was going on in Korea, but also in terms of the Malayan emergency, the crackdown by the British, the beginnings of what was happening in Vietnam. The French were still there, with the Americans yet to take over, and of course, African freedom movements. So yes, I think there are many examples that one could give of how this was the worst feature of the European sort of model, which Gandhi was arguing against in his Asian Relations Conference speech. But I think there were artists also who were trying to convey the same message. What was the next question? There was a third.
Dipto's question was about whether there was any Islamic response
Yeah.
to the concept of universalism.
How did they inculcate it within their own poetry culture? Like specifically in the case of Middle East,
Yeah.
like in India they were doing. So.
Yes. Even though I criticized Niall Green for his misreading of Binoy Kumar Sarkar, he has a recent book where he uses a lot of Persian sources from Iran to show how in Iran there was an engagement with various Asian forms. And there is a very fine Turkish historian, Seljuk Esenbel, who has written a great deal on the interactions between Turkey and Japan, the two extremities of the Asian continent. And what she shows is that there was a great deal of intermingling of the figure of the Prophet Muhammad and of Buddha, and so on. So there was this kind of a conversation that was going on constantly between what you are referring to as the, Muslim sort of West Asia and East Asia, there were Turkish figures going and establishing the first mosque in Tokyo in Japan, and taking back various Buddhistic ideas to the Ottoman domains, and then post-Ottoman Turkey and so on. And I think it was very instructive that you talked about Javednama, which is an early 30s, and Iqbal actually first gave a lecture on his poem Javednama at the time of the roundtable conferences in London in the early 1930s. And in the audience was Mahatma Gandhi. So as you can see, and that continued when Sadegh, the great painter, gave visual representation or expression to Iqbal's poetry. What you find in his murals is that there is Iqbal sitting with his cheek on his hand, but next to him, next to Iqbal, who is there in Sadegh Khan's famous mural? It's none other than Rabindranath Tagore. And there are others like Einstein next to Rabindranath and so on. So there was this, there was a very conscious effort to, cross rigidly drawn religious boundaries.
I know that you may have many more questions, but because of time, we'll take maybe 3 more. So may I have a show of hands? Maybe in the back, Ambarin, yes.
Good afternoon, sir. I'm Amitesh Chattopadhyay from Mathematics Department of 5th semester. I have a question that whenever we are talking about art, poetry and culture and all of these things in the contemporary world or in the medieval worlds, everyone is talking about a symbol for which they are living, for which they will fight, for which they will progress. But for a certain point, I'm always seeing that they are missing the basic point of rationalism, where I'm saying that this is common sense and we are working and we are fighting for a common ground of harmony. Like in India, there is Sanal Edamaruku who has been exiled to Finland by the local churches only. Then there was Kaliburgi, then there was Mr. Dadbolkar, who are killed for just talking on behalf of rationalism. So while we are talking about art, poetry and all these things, somehow I think we are just portraying this idea of a radical symbolism, where we are just ignoring the fact that rationalism plays a very vital role in the daily to daily life. And in the ancient, or I will say the medieval world also, almost all the problems that are happening or that has happened has happened because of this radical symbolism that has been always propagated.
Keep it short. Keep it
Thank you,
short.
sir.
Rationalism.
What is the frame your question?
So what was the exact point of like somehow ignoring rationalism and putting all these things over that?
Deal of rationalism and thought. Any more questions? One.
Good afternoon, sir. My name is Alap. I'm from Semester 1 History Department. And my question is in respect of a universal Asian Union of the then which emerged as an idealistic concept within the then late 1800s and the early 1900s. What I understand about Asia from that point of view is that Calcutta, or specifically Bengal, became the center of such idealistic ideas, intellectual thoughts. So when we talk about Asian Union, when leaders of Bengal talk about this, does Calcutta take a dominant position if an Asian Union in such a form of the European Union comes into existence, even in a form of theory? Does Calcutta or Indians take a predominant position in its leadership?
Maybe the girl who had her hand up from a long time. Yes.
Good afternoon, sir. This is Gauri Sharma from the Department of Philosophy, Semester 1. Firstly, thank you very, very much for the highly enriching and informative lecture. My question was, one of the previous questions asked about what was the common people's response with regards to the cultural exchanges and solidarity and accomplishments among the Asians in these realms. I was curious to know what was the Western world's response to these Asian exchanges. Was it taken notice of by the Western world, and what kind of recognition was given to this? And from your research, how do you see the trajectory? Like, has the discourse really evolved from a Eurocentric point of view to, in the current times, to a more pluralistic viewpoint, or is it still predominantly Eurocentric? So, yeah, thank you.
I think that would be the last question, sir.
Yeah, well, first of all, you know, I wouldn't draw a very sharp contrast between reason and emotion, or, you know, maybe the better term would be intuition. You know, there is a form of rationalism which in fact can be a form of rational bigotry as well. However, I think even if you think about faith, genuine faith is always reason-based. And since we mentioned Iqbal a little while ago, even if you think about the term ishq, you know, it's sometimes translated as love, but you know, a more accurate translation may in fact be intuition, which is not entirely opposed to reason. So I would just not you know, accept this that cultural expression is mere symbolism, and that there is, you know, a form of rational argumentation which is completely separate from the domain of culture or artist expression. You know, beyond that, you know, this is a big question that you have asked, and of course I would absolutely condemn attacks on those who are self-professed rationalists that have been taking place, and you took some names. But I think we need to be open to the idea that you know, the politics of affect need not necessarily be anti-reason. So that's what I would suggest for the moment. Now, just remind me of the second question. The
second question was asked whether Bengal will take.
Yes, of course, Calcutta. Yeah, I wish that would happen. You know, there were very far-sighted intellectuals, you know, poets, artists, political leaders who were based in Calcutta or in Bengal as a whole, who definitely, you know, took a lead in articulating various visions of Asian universalism. I'm not sure whether we have maintained that intellectual tradition in the early 21st century, something that was so vibrant in the early 20th century. But I would still say that Calcutta and Bengal is so strategically located within the geography of Asia that the potential for Bengal, or in fact this metropolis, to play some kind of a role in recovering some of this Asian idea is something that we ought to work for. And maybe it's the younger generation which can play that role. And when Vivekananda went to Japan in 1893 before going to Chicago, he actually made a point of saying that young people from India should go abroad and engage with the rest of the world. And as you can see, there were very young scholars and intellectuals who became globetrotters and who became visionaries for some kind of a global future that would be very different from the one that Europe was seeking to impose on the rest of the world. There was a questioning of the European claim to monopoly over universalism, that we are not going to just defend our own culture. We too have something to say about how the globe should be reformatted, if you will. The final question is a very poignant one, especially in the moment that we are living through at this point. European imperialists, including Western liberals, quote unquote, were deeply suspicious of attempts by the colonized to forge larger links, beyond their own colonies and beyond the borders of their own nations. So there were always these ideas that there was some kind of a pan-Islamic conspiracy, or that there were Chinese secret societies which were engaged in conspiratorial activities against Western imperial powers. And so it's, in many ways, Europeans were more concerned about the extraterritorial dimensions of anti-colonial nationalism rather than the territorially bounded ones. And that's why, I mentioned how Iqbal was saying that they think of pan-Islamism as akin to the yellow peril. The Asians, getting together to fight against us. And that's why, because there was a pejorative element in the definition of both pan-Islamism and pan-Asianism, there were very far-sighted intellectuals who actually wanted to drop the prefix pan and say that we will not accept this European pejorative definition of the solidarities that we are seeking to forge. And as would have been evident when I was quoting Sarojini Naidu, she's saying that I sent an invitation to Asian leaders to come to an Asian relations conference. And that seems to be a red rag for centuries of quote-unquote Western civilization. And finally, what I will say is that, the global color line was, ubiquitous during the period that I was sort of writing about, the long 20th century, from 1880 onwards. And we might have imagined that we have left that era behind. But unfortunately, what we are seeing today happening in Palestine basically reminds us that this, global color line seems to be as salient as before, as it had been 100 years ago. And living and working in the United States as I do, I find some of the bigotry that is being spouted to be very similar to the early 1920s, when there was talk about Asian exclusion, leading to the Orientals Exclusion Act of 1924, which was enacted while Tagore was just about to leave China for Japan. And therefore, unfortunately, I have to say that for Europe, these movements towards Asian or other kinds of solidarity across what we describe today as the global South always seems to be deemed to be a threat. And one is really sad to be able to have to say this, but non-white lives don't matter in the same way as white lives. Otherwise, you would not see the United States, giving a carte blanche for the massacre of tens of thousands of innocent women and children. So that is unfortunately where we are, at this moment in history. And you can see, even in, let's say, the votes that have been taken in the General Assembly, that what the divide is in today's world. And the approach of both the United States and Western Europe has been a huge contrast when it came to the crisis in Ukraine and the crisis that we are living through in Palestine. So in that sense, I would have to say that the best forms of Asian universalism, including the versions that were articulated by somebody like a Rabindranath Tagore, always was expressed in the context of a conception of shared humanity. And that is what we should aspire for today, and absolutely rejecting the global color line that was drawn by European imperialist powers throughout the modern era of history.
Thank you so much, sir. And I think the last answer that you gave, raises more questions. And I think that is how it should be, especially in an academic setting. Now, I would like to welcome back Dr. Chatterjee to the stage to bring the proceedings to an end.
Thank you, Professor Gotakurta. I'm like a bad penny, keep popping up. So that was wonderful. And there's no end to questions. I know the students are waiting, but the timekeeper always plays the villain of the piece. So we do have to draw it to a close. While I invite the IQAC coordinator to offer the formal vote of thanks, I would tell you, please don't go away. We will have the national anthem after that, and then I have some announcements to make. Thank you.
Thank you, Kaberidi. It is my privilege to accord the vote of thanks in this august gathering. I would begin by expressing my profound gratitude to Professor Sugata Bose, Gardiner Professor of Oceanic History and Affairs, Harvard University, for accepting our request to deliver the 9th Alexander Duff Memorial Lecture. Thank you so much, sir, for taking us through this beautiful journey through art, poetry, music, in Asian conversations. And we would love to hear you in the future too, especially on the aspect of Scottish and Indian connection. I am grateful to the members of the governing body, members of the college senators, members from churches, our chaplain, our former principals, our former vice principals, former faculty members, members from the former Students Association for their gracious presence. We are also honored to have with us guests and dignitaries and friends of the colleges with us today to grace this august gathering. I am thankful to our secretary, Dr. Shopan Kumar Mukhuti, our principal, Dr. Madhumanjari Mondol, our vice principal, Dr. Shupratim Das, and all the IMC members for their support to stage this program. I'm thankful to all the faculty members, students, the different committee members, and our support staff for all their support to stage today's program. A special thanks to Dr. Kabiri Chatterjee for conducting this program so efficiently, and Dr. Shrimoy Guho Thakurta for conducting the question answer session. Thank you all once again for being such a wonderful audience, and do take care of yourself. And wishes from the Scottish Church College family for a blissful Christmas ahead. Thank you.
The one person who didn't get thanked in that vote of thanks is Dr. Shamrat Bhattacharjee, our IQAC coordinator, who's the backbone of every program that we organize and everything that we do in college. He's there, much like a kind of invisible presence, and he's always there when we come up to him with ideas, however, you know, what we want to do. So I think I would request the entire audience to thank Professor Shamrat Bhattacharjee for being there. And now we will have the national anthem.
জনগণ মন অধিনায়ক জয় হে ভারত ভাগ্য বিধাতা পাঞ্জাব সিন্ধু গুজরাট মারাঠা দ্রাবিড় উৎকল বঙ্গ বিন্ধ্য হিমাচল যমুনা গঙ্গা উচ্ছল জলধি তরঙ্গ তব শুভ নামে জাগে তব শুভ আশিস মাগে গাহে তব জয় গাথা জনগণ মঙ্গল দায়ক জয় হে ভারত ভাগ্য বিধাতা জয় হে জয় হে জয় হে জয় 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 জয়